Hello again, it's me, and this is our third and final week directly with Playing in the Dark. It's backwards, that's reversed, but you get the point. Playing in the Dark is our third week with this text. I know that's a long time with a single text, but it's a complex work of criticism, and I think it deserves the full attention that we've been giving it. Next week, we're moving on to Heart of Darkness, and by the middle of this week, I will be posting, as I've mentioned a couple of times, links to audio book versions of that book. And again, it's not the most difficult book you'll ever read. If you continue on through 2 years of college or 4 years of college, or if you're a reader. Conrad is a medium hard read, I would say, but some of his works, Nostromo and Lord Jim, are particularly difficult. But his shorter works like Heart of Darkness, The Secret Sharer, short stories, they're generally more approachable, more readable. But he's still a naughty writer in some ways. And so we'll begin looking at that book next week in the same way that we've looked at this one, taking one section. There's 3 sections of that book as well, taking one at a time and really reading through it very carefully. And we'll then get to the ultimate, which is kind of combining the ideas from both books together. So part 3 of Playing in the Dark has a long and kind of mysterious title that doesn't become clear until very near the end of her Toni Morrison's discussion of Ernest Hemingway, near the end of the essay itself, disturbing nurses and the kindness of sharks, and in that rather grotesque brief conversation that Harry has with his wife, Marie, in To Have and Have Not, the novel, the 1937 novel by Ernest Hemingway that Morrison spends a great deal of that part discussing for reasons we'll get to. But it's about whether or not Harry in his younger days had sex with a black woman. And just very briefly, I'll read that section. Listen, did you ever do it with a N-word, wench? Sure. What's it like? Marie asks. Like Nurse Shark, which Morrison says is an extraordinary remark, and it is extraordinary. I mean, in what ways is having sex with a human woman, black or any other hue, like having sex with a shark, and specifically a nurse shark, which is I'm not sure how familiar any of you might be with sharks or species of shark, but nurse sharks are not terribly dangerous to human beings. In fact, as far as I know, no one has ever been attacked by a nurse shark. They're about 6 feet long, as I understand, but they are bottom feeders, scavengers, and not aggressive in the least. But again, the joke, and Marie laughs and she says, "You're funny," to that bizarre simile that Harry comes up with, that sleeping with a black woman is like somehow sleeping with a harmless shark. So that's the reference of the title. Of course, Morrison decorates it a little bit more with the image of disturbing, and I would certainly say that Harry Morgan's simile is disturbing, and the kindness of sharks, and she's kind of combining, Playing in the Dark. Again, we're going back to that original idea of something fun in a dangerous situation, or something dangerous in a fun situation. We talked about playing hide and seek and so on in the dark. And so these are kind of oxymoronic juxtapositions. You would think the kindness of nurses and disturbing sharks, not the disturbing nurses and kindness of sharks. So again, it's playing with what we expect and then flipping everything upside down on its head. And again, the images that pervade American culture and American literature, at the same time, of African American characters in literature or African American people being somehow dangerous to white people, or being subservient, nurse-like figures. And that's kind of the dichotomy that you get in a lot of early American literature, is that they're either like the maid or nurse in Gone with the Wind, who are completely subservient to their white master, or they are like, the beast that George T. Wilson imagines in that horrible passage that we quoted a couple of weeks ago, where he describes basically an attacking, marauding, violent monster, black man, who's a threat to white women and children in particular. The epigram, I always like to explore the epigrams. There's reasons that writers put epigrams at the beginnings of chapters, is from a poem that I've never really read thoroughly or discussed with anybody or studied in any course, even though I studied a fair amount of William Carlos Williams' poetry. He's one of my favorite poets, in fact. It's a longer poem. He usually writes fairly short poems, but it's a longer one, and it imagines a new Adam and Eve. But in this poem, somehow he's an English person and with a British passport, and he's sort of like Robinson Crusoe, found himself washed up on some sort of Caribbean or tropical island somewhere. It isn't specified, but I'm guessing Caribbean because of the seemingly indigenous population, or at least the other people that Williams imagines on the island with him. And who are these other people? Well, they are black women and Latin or Spanish women, and thus my imagination says that's probably the Caribbean. So this innocent, if you will, Adam is there with all of these not so innocent, apparently, dark women, and the fleshly temptations that their bodies provide for him. And whether or not that's ever consummated in the poem is not entirely clear to me. But again, it's that ease with which a white writer, Williams lived from the late 1800s to the 1960s, and the ease with which a writer like him, a white man, would slide into these sort of tropes, these sort of ideas of black women being a danger to young boys, through their intense sexuality. So again, Morrison puts it there as a sort of way of re-emphasizing some of those assumptions and assertions that white writers make. In this section, Morrison begins with a discussion of race as being not an actual thing, and we know that it isn't. I've discussed that before, but that it's become a metaphor equally powerful to any actual biological thing. So that the metaphor of blackness, the metaphor of race, regardless of whether race actually exists as a thing, it's become such a part of our culture and such a powerful metaphor in our culture that it pervades everything that we do. She says, it's a way of referring to and disguising forces, events, classes, and expressions of social decay and economic division, far more threatening to the body politic than biological race ever was. And that's on page 63. In other words, the horror on the one hand of the George T. Wilson quotation, that looming monster of the black man, and the seductive either nurse or sex goddess of the black woman, that those things have pervaded our culture and our literature beyond any measure that anything real would do. The metaphor is more powerful than reality in many ways, she says. She mentions social decay and economic division, and I would throw into that, of course, our political world as well. And how much is this informed in our culture? She lists on the next page or so half a dozen things. The Constitution, the very document that created the United States to begin with, of course, contains the Three-Fifths Compromise that in order to win Southern votes for ratification of the Constitution, the northern states agreed to what was called the Three-Fifths Compromise, that for purposes of population count, even though it did not count in any way legally as people, African American slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person in terms of population. And that got enough of the Southerners to agree to go along, because if the Southerners weren't able to agree if they weren't able to count in some way, shape, or form their enslaved people, then their populations would be much, much smaller, and they would have less representation in Congress, in the House of Representatives at least, and in terms of the Electoral College as well, and selecting the president. Senators at that time were appointed by state governors, and every state gets 2 senators regardless of population. So Wyoming, which has a very tiny population, has the same exact number of senators that California does, even though California is the most populous state in the country. And that's become an issue increasingly in the 20th and 21st century, that these tiny states, in terms of population, are vastly overrepresented in the Senate, and they are able to completely quash political plans and political and bills and so forth in a way that they couldn't do if the representation was based on population. The other big, there are several amendments to the Constitution that deal directly with race. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery except in the case of imprisonment. And so prisoners are in captivity in a slave-like way, but their labor also can be, at least through the 13th Amendment, their labor can be required of them and without compensation. The 13th Amendment has lots of flaws, have several of the amendments. The 14th deals with race, specifically the 15th as well. The franchise, in other words, voting. And of course, we all know that voting rights are constantly under attack in our country, and certainly based along racial lines or perceived racial lines. Again, the metaphor of race being more powerful than any reality that race actually could impinge on us. Public schools and the separate but equal Supreme Court decision in Plessy versus Ferguson allowed states to segregate based on race for 75 years. Even in the post Brown versus Board of Education world that we live in, schools are still segregated, not by law, but by demographics, by where people live. There have been attempts to integrate schools, and every time that happens, there's tremendous pushback mostly by white parents who don't want their children mingling with African American students. So white flight, it's called, when white people fled the inner cities and moved to the suburbs because they were able to afford a house and they were able to afford a car. They could therefore travel greater distances to get to work, whereas African Americans generally and other minority groups stayed in the cities. And so those city schools in a city like Rochester, where I lived for 30 years, the inner city schools, the city schools, the City of Rochester School District, about 80% black. And then all around Rochester, the city, are these suburbs, like a big donut. And those suburbs are almost 100% white. And so the schools there, because they teach the students who live in those school districts, those schools are about 80% white. So you have 80% black in the city schools, 80% white in the suburban schools. And so we're just as segregated as we ever were. It's just that the laws that put segregation in place are no longer constitutional. Representation in legislative bodies, just like the school districts and so forth, large areas where large numbers of minorities live are often chopped up through the gerrymandering process, so that those areas can never achieve a full representative minority representative. If you take a large area, say the city of Rochester, which, say, for purpose of argument, is a big round pie, and you divide that pie into 4 chunks, and you put chunk 1 over here, chunk 2 over there, chunk 3 over here, and chunk 4 over there, and you cut up the voting districts that way, you can make a permanent minority within a majority white congressional district simply by manipulating where the election boundaries are, and that is done constantly throughout in our country. So what happens is that even though African Americans represent somewhere around 13-14% of the American population, they're nowhere close to that in the Senate or in the House of Representatives or in most state legislative bodies. They are underrepresented people, and all minorities as well. Law and policing, of course. You don't need to be a genius to figure out how law and policing are part of the racial problem in our country today. Theology, even debates over, Santa Claus is white, and that kind of stuff. And Santa Claus is a theological figure, but great controversies arise when anybody suggests that Christ might not have been Caucasian, at least to some people, in the way he's pictured in paintings and so forth. The most segregated hour of the week, people say, is church hour on Sunday mornings in the Christian world, because again, white people and African American people very rarely mingle in the same congregation. Just like our schools, our churches are segregated not by law, but by where people live. Banking and mortgages. We talked briefly about redlining a couple of lessons back. If you are an African American person trying to get a mortgage, trying to get a loan, much, much more difficult than if you are a white person making the same income. Manifest destiny, which is a completely racist part of our past. Our immigration practices, who gets to immigrate to the United States. Our families are vastly segregated based on race in the most cases. And of course, literature, which is what Morrison's really writing about here. But she wanted to list all of those ways in which our culture and our society is divided along this metaphorical racial line. She lists 6, she seems to like the number 6, she lists 6 things that she calls common linguistic strategies to engage the serious consequences of blacks in our literature. And I'll go through these very, very quickly. Economy of the stereotype. It's much easier to write about people of in another racial category, whether it's African Americans, Native Americans, using racial stereotypes. As aware as we are of these, and as much as we try to weed them out of our literature and our movies and our TV shows and our advertisement, blah, 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 they still emerge. It's just easier if you aren't familiar with anybody who is in another racial category. It's easier to stereotype than to write honestly about them. Metonymic displacement. Metonymy is a literary device in which part of the body represents the whole of the body, and so it's a way again of stereotyping based on these tropes about people's bodies and their brains. Metaphysical condensation, another shorthand form, weaning out the humanness of somebody and presenting them just as a type. Fetishization, which again, going back to the nurse shark, is about the sexuality and the terrifying sexuality of the African American male from the non-African American male perspective, that he is a danger to my wife, my daughter, but also again that fetishization of women of color, that they are more earthy, that they are more this, they are more that. And that has been part of our literature for a very long time, and we see that come in the discussion of Hemingway. Dehistorizing allegory, where allegory, again, a tale that is composed of parts that represent other things. Dehistoricizing it, meaning taking the true history of an event or thing, and instead putting in an allegorical idea about it. And finally, patterns of explosive, disjointed, and repetitive language. And one doesn't need to read very far into much of American literature to see, first of all, that African American characters are almost uniformly silent, or if they are not silent, they're grunting, with repetitive language, which I won't even attempt to repeat, but truly horrible stuff. I'm going to stop this one, and I'm going to place another one on because I'm getting to the YouTube timeout time. And the next bit, which will be posted right away after this bit, we'll deal with the Hemingway section. And so I'll see you in a few